You know what I've always like found strange? Like nobody questions where the Romans came from. Like nobody questions where the Greeks came from. Nobody questions where the Egyptians came from. But the moment someone asks who's the Israelites are, suddenly the conversation becomes controversial. Why? Because the answer could change the way millions of people see history and maybe even themselves. All right, so for most of my life, right, I never thought much about the Israelites. Like they were just people from the Bible, you know, ancient history, a story that happened thousands of years ago. But then I started reading for myself, not listening to what somebody else told me, not relying on movies, not relying on paintings, but actually, like, you know, reading the scriptures. And the deeper I went, the more questions I had, you know. So most of the images people associate with biblical history were created long after the events themselves. I mean, we all know that, right? Paintings, movies, religious artwork. I mean, I started asking myself, like, what did these people actually you know, look like? Where did they come from? And we are the descendants today. For me, this is bigger than race. It's actually about identity for me. It's also, you know, it's about heritage. Like, you know, so basically, it's about knowing where you come from, and when the people lose their language, which it happened in history. You know what I'm saying? We've seen a lot of different cultures, you know, names and history. That eventually somebody else tells them who they are, right? I mean, we've been going through that, like, so. And after enough generations, they start believing it. Okay, so a growing number of people believe that many black people throughout the African diaspora may be descendants of the ancient Israelites described in the Bible. They believe the descendants are still here today, living under different names, in different countries, speaking different languages, completely unaware of who they might be. Think about that. Now, I mean, I'm just saying, whether you agree with the idea or not, right? There's one question that deserves an answer, right? If the Israelites were scattered throughout the world, where did they go? Poof. Where did they go? Like, where did they go? Did they disappear? Do entire vibes vanish from history? I mean, come on, think about, like, or are their descendants still here today, hidden in plain sight? I mean, to understand why millions of people believe this theory, we have to start with one chapter. And a lot of people are gonna be like, "Oh, you do over." Like, I'm just saying. Look, this is what. Just start with one chapter. Start with one chapter. One chapter that many believe describes events thousands of years before they happened. Was in the Bible, Deuteronomy 28. All right, so Deuteronomy 28 is a chapter in the Bible where Moses gives a message to the children of Israel before they enter the promised land, right? And contains blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience, right? Okay, so the chapter actually begins for obedience and warnings for disobedience. Okay, supporters of the theory focus on the curses because they believe these events match later historically experiences. Okay? Alright. One of the major themes is captivity, right? Alright, so the chapter describes a people who would experience hardship, servitude, and domination by foreign powers. Another major theme is scattering. The Israelites are warned that they will be dispersed among many nations. Believers point to this as evidence of a global diaspora, right? So supporters often focus on the idea that people, right, can lose their language, right, customs, names, and connections to their original heritage over generations. Do you agree or disagree? I mean, for many believers, Deuteronomy 28, right? Going back to Deuteronomy 28. It's not just about ancient history. They see it as a roadmap, right? This is a roadmap that helps explain the experiences of the people who were displaced and scattered. Do the events described in Deuteronomy 28 refer to only to the ancient Israel, or do they point to a later, how can I say it, a later event as well? This is where the debate begins. All right, so look, next we examine one of the most discussed verses in this entire chapter, Deuteronomy 28:68, and the reference to ships. So, many supporters of the theory focuses on Deuteronomy 28:68, right? They argue that this verse contains details they believe connects directly to later events in world history. Okay, so the most commonly discussed part of the verse is the reference to the ships. Argue that this resembles the transportation of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean during the slave trade. Okay, millions of men, women, and children were taken from Africa and transported to their American families. We're separated, right? Cultures were disrupted, and identities were transformed across generations. Check on that last name that you got. Many supporters, right, point out that the enslaved people often lost their original names, languages, and tribal identities. They see that as a major part of the diaspora experiences. Okay, so the theory that argues that descendants of these dispersed populations eventually spread throughout North America, like, okay, South America, the Caribbean, and beyond, and beyond, way beyond. So for many people, the connection is not just about a single verse. It is all about seeing patterns between biblical warnings and historical events that affected millions. Many historians, many historians interpret Deuteronomy 28 in the context of ancient Israel and do not view it as a prediction of the Atlantic slave trade. They do not view it as a prediction of the Atlantic slave trade. This is one of the key disagreements in the debate. If Israel was scattered, where did the descendants go? Next, we explore the lost tribes, migration theories, and connections to Africa. One of the biggest questions in biblical history is what happened to the tribes after ancient Israel was conquered and scattered? And this is a topic that's, it is what it is. Did they disappear? Or did they continue under different identities. Look, in the 8th century BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Israelites. Large populations were deported, right? Creating the foundation for later discussions about the so-called lost tribes. Later, the kingdom of Judah faced conquest by Babylon. Okay. Exile became a major theme in Israelite history and shaped future identity, culture, and dispersion. Okay. Supporters of the theory argue that over centuries, some descendants moved into religions of Africa, right? Some descendants moved into regions of Africa and became part of the populations that later developed under different names and kingdoms. Put that in your brain. Believers, like, look, you have believers, non-believers, look, but believers, look, often point to civilizations such as Kush, Nubia, and Ethiopia when discussing ancient Africa connections, right? These religions interacted with neighboring cultures for centuries, right? So long before modern times, Jewish communities existed in Africa. Okay, groups such as the Beta Israel in Ethiopia are frequently discussed in conversations about African and Israelite connections, right? If populations were scattered, and mixed, migrated and renamed over thousands of years, how will we identify their descendants today? Now look, just review all the big, just why does the evidence show? What do historians say? And why does this debate continue today? Because I've seen a lot of people talk, certain people talking on this subject, whatever like that. But I'm a small channel, and I'm just developing up. But that's. Supporters believe the experience of slavery, scattering, captivity, and the loss of identity closely resembles biblical descriptions given to ancient Israel. They see these connections as evidence that descendants of Israel may exist throughout the African diaspora today. So most historians and archaeologists, excuse my language, conclude that the ancient Israelites emerged in the Levant, and that the current evidence does not establish that all black people descend from the 12 tribes. This remains the mainstream academic position, right? So the discussion continues because people are examining the same historical records, scriptures, traditions, and events while reaching different conclusions. The question involves faith, history, identity, and interpretation, right? So for many people, this conversation goes beyond genealogy, right? It's just about heritage, like belonging, ancestry, and understanding where people come from after generations of displacement and change, right? So whether someone accepts or rejects the theory, the subject encourages people to read, study, right? Compare sources and investigate history for themselves, right? Rather than relying solely on what others tell them. The goal is not to tell people what to think. The goal is to encourage, critical thinking, deeper research, and open up discussions about some of the most important questions in history. If the Israelites scattered, right? If they scattered among the nations, where are their descendants today? Where do you find? Where is that at? Is this a forgotten chapter, like of a history, a misunderstood interpretation, like, or a mystery that still has not been fully answered? Like, come on, we need questions, man. We need questions, y'all. We need questions. Somebody give me some answers. I need some answers. Read the scriptures, study the evidence, research the history, ask questions, and come to your own conclusion. Because the search for truth becomes when we are willing to investigate for ourselves, y'all.
The conscious signal.